I had such big plans for this video. It was going to be a tutorial on making my sourdough sandwich loaf recipe, which I know a lot of you guys have been requesting. I have heard you. I'm just a busy homeschool mom, so I was waiting for all the stars to align to publish a recipe for you guys. So I decided to tackle it, and I took a bunch of video, and then my dough was not developing. The gluten wasn't developing in my dough. So I bailed on this becoming the sourdough sandwich loaf tutorial, and instead I decided to make one on how to save your dough if it doesn't turn out like it's supposed to. There's a good chunk of baking that is following the recipe exactly, but when mistakes happen, your scale messes up at some point, or there's a bunch of variables that can mess up your dough. I'm not sure what happened in this one, if my scale was off and I overhydrated the dough, I added too much water, or if I overheated the dough, because I did add pretty hot water out of my tea kettle when I was making it, and heat is the enemy of gluten. But I wanted to go ahead and show you guys what happens if your dough doesn't end up looking like it's supposed to, and how to save it. So this was quite a bit of dough. This is enough for 4 sandwich loaves, and it's with fresh milled flour. I'm using a hard white in this recipe. And when the dough didn't come together, I keep checking it for window pane, and the window pane just isn't happening. So the gluten isn't there to make it into bread. It needs quite a bit of gluten in order to develop a nice rise to bake and have a nice fluffy loaf of bread. So if you're not getting good gluten development, you definitely don't want to just throw it in your bread pans and hope for the best. You want to figure out how to get that gluten developed so you can salvage your dough. So here I just mixed the first ingredients together. It was a nice shaggy dough, and then I let it sit for 20 minutes to hydrate. When using fresh milled flour, you have to let it absorb the water. It's not like shelf-stable flour that doesn't need that time to absorb. So I let it sit for about 20 minutes, and this is normally when I mix it together and it comes together, it develops the gluten, and I get to window pane within 5 minutes of mixing after I let it do that initial rest. And once I get through my 5 minutes of mixing here, I discover I'm not anywhere close to window pane. So window pane is when I stretch it out in between my fingers, and if it tears really easily, you know that you haven't let it mix long enough, or there's some variable that needs to be tweaked to get to window pane. When you can stretch it and it has a nice rubbery feel to the gluten. The gluten's like a rubber band, so if you stretch it, it should kind of stretch like a rubber band. You can feel it when you're pulling the dough out for a window pane. So I'll go ahead and fast forward to where I start to test it for window pane after 5 minutes of mixing. And I'm back. I wet my hands and I'm checking for window pane. You can see it rips right away. That's not what you want. This is when I start to question, what did I do wrong that my recipe didn't work exactly how I imagined it to and how it always works. Of course, you have to expect the unexpected when you're recording things for other people. It seems like that's 9 times out of 10 when I will mess up. My first guess is I didn't let it hydrate long enough because it says the fresh milled flour. So I let it sit for 20 more minutes, and then I'm going to run another 5-minute knead on it to see if that did the trick. Sometimes it is as simple as just letting the dough rest a little bit longer with fresh milled flour. So that's step number 1 of my troubleshooting. So here I knead again. I'll fast forward and show you the window pane. So again, that was letting it rest for 20 minutes, kneading for 5 more minutes. I'm not super hopeful because it's still not cleaning the sides of the bowl, but I'll give it a shot, and it rips. So now I'm going to move on to my next step in troubleshooting, which is I'm starting to think that I just need to add more flour. At this stage in the process, I wasn't expecting this whole thing to take as long and to need troubleshooting. I'm trying to meet my friends to go skiing. I don't want to wait to hydrate the fresh milled flour, so I just grabbed some of my organic white bread flour out of the pantry. This doesn't require that 20-minute rest to hydrate so that you can develop gluten, so it's a lot more of an immediate feedback loop if you're just trying to get your dough to window pane and you're on time constraints. So you can just add the white flour and start mixing and wait and watch. And you can see as I start adding the white flour, I'm going to add quite a bit, a couple cups worth at least of this white flour. But the end result is that I will get to window pane and it will start cleaning the sides of the bowl. It starts to look like bread dough needs to look before you can turn it into bread. You don't need to develop gluten for everything, but bread, it is crucial. So if you cannot window pane your dough with your hands, do not attempt to bake it or finish the final steps with that dough. Make sure that it gets to window pane first so you don't disappoint yourself later. So here, my Bosch does a great job of mixing flour quickly to develop the gluten, and it only took a couple minutes with adding more flour to get there. I added flour a couple different times and I'm just watching it now. It starts to smooth out, stretch. Oh man, it's just a million times better this go around, finishing it off with the flour. I was concerned I might have to bail on this batch of dough, but I'm glad to rescue it all and show you guys how to rescue your dough in the process. It's a lot of visual at this stage in the game, so just kind of play with it and watch it. But yeah, so adding the flour is working here. It's cleaning the sides of the bowl. The Bosch is doing its job. I'm very happy at this stage, and then I'm about to do the last window pane, which shows me that it is ready to go into the fridge and do the initial bulk ferment overnight in the fridge because this is sourdough. And then I will do the remaining rise tomorrow and then bake it. Don't forget to wet your hands. I kind of play around with it a little bit here. It's nice and rubbery, but it does start to break a little bit. So I go ahead and run the Bosch mixer just a little bit longer. The Bosch has been so much nicer for kneading the dough than the KitchenAid, but it is a lot harder to clean than the KitchenAid. So that's the downside of the Bosch, but it develops the gluten way more effectively than the KitchenAid ever did. So I gave it another little spin and then I'll recheck window pane. Checking it this time around after another 5 minutes in the Bosch, it's looking substantially better. I can pull it out quite a bit bigger, and this is what we call window pane, is when you can get a nice big stretch out of it without starting to tear. You can see I just keep easing it out. I start to get a few little rips, but this is where I need it to be at to turn it into bread. So this dough has been saved. Now we can turn this into the bread. I gave it a few more whirls in the Bosch just for good measure. Then we will move on to the bulk ferment. But this is how you rescue your bread. So take a look at your dough, read your dough. Do not just read the recipe. Make sure if something doesn't look right, that you stop and you reevaluate and you fix it. I'm doing one more window pane. Here we go again. It's looking great. Now I'm going to divide it into 2 batches in my oiled Cambro containers and put it in the fridge for the night. So here you can see again where it starts to rip, but that looks pretty good to me. Next up, I will be making a video on my sourdough sandwich loaf recipe. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe if you want the recipe. And I hope this tutorial is helpful for everyone on how to salvage your dough or what you're looking for when you make dough. So if you're new to bread making, not everyone grew up making dough. I didn't. I had to teach myself. So now I know a lot more about it. I hope this is helpful.